It started with one inmate, then another, and then another. Inside a women's maximum security prison, whispers spread like wildfire as prisoners locked away began falling pregnant one by one. The guards had no answers. The warden demanded silence. But when the hidden cameras finally revealed the truth, what they caught left the entire prison and the world in shock. Stay with me until the end, because this story will leave you stunned. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. What I'm about to tell you happened at Riverside Maximum Security Correctional Facility, a place where the most dangerous female offenders serve their time. This isn't just any prison story. This is about a mystery that baffled investigators, shocked medical professionals, and turned everything everyone thought they knew about prison security upside down. By the time you finish watching this video, you'll understand why this case made international headlines and why it changed prison protocols forever. The first sign something was wrong came on a cold Tuesday morning in March. Sarah Martinez, the head nurse at Riverside, was conducting her routine medical rounds when inmate Rebecca Thompson complained of nausea and fatigue. Rebecca had been serving a 15-year sentence for armed robbery and had been a model prisoner for 3 years. What Sarah discovered during that examination would haunt her for months to come. The pregnancy test came back positive. Sarah stared at the results in disbelief. She ran the test again, then a third time. Each result was the same. Rebecca Thompson, locked away in a maximum security facility with no male contact whatsoever, was 8 weeks pregnant. The impossibility of the situation sent Sarah's mind racing. How could this happen? How could any of this be possible? But Rebecca wasn't talking. When Sarah questioned her about how this could have occurred, the young woman simply shook her head and remained silent. Her eyes held a fear that Sarah had never seen before, not even from the most hardened criminals who passed through her clinic. Something was terribly wrong, and Rebecca was too scared to say what it was. Sarah immediately reported the pregnancy to Warden Patricia Collins, a stern woman who had run Riverside for over 2 decades. Collins had seen everything during her career, but this news left her speechless. In all her years managing the facility, nothing like this had ever happened. The security protocols at Riverside were ironclad. Male staff never had unsupervised contact with female inmates. Every interaction was monitored, recorded, and documented. Conjugal visits weren't permitted at maximum security facilities. So how had Rebecca become pregnant? The warden ordered a full investigation. Security footage was reviewed frame by frame. Staff schedules were scrutinized. Every male employee underwent questioning. But after weeks of investigation, they found nothing. No breach in protocol, no suspicious behavior, no explanation for what seemed impossible. Then, just 2 weeks after Rebecca's discovery, another inmate came forward with similar symptoms. Maria Santos had been serving time for drug trafficking. Like Rebecca, she had been a quiet prisoner who kept to herself and followed all the rules. When her pregnancy test also came back positive, the whispers throughout the prison grew louder. 2 pregnant inmates in a maximum security facility where pregnancy should have been impossible. The other prisoners began to take notice, and fear started to spread through the corridors. Maria, like Rebecca before her, refused to explain how her pregnancy had occurred. She sat in the medical examination room, tears streaming down her face, but her lips remained sealed. Whatever was happening at Riverside, the women involved were too terrified to speak about it. Warden Collins knew she had a crisis on her hands. 2 unexplained pregnancies meant there was a systematic problem, not just an isolated incident. She contacted the State Corrections Department and requested additional security personnel and investigators. The media hadn't caught wind of the story yet, but Collins knew it was only a matter of time. When they did, the scandal would be enormous. The investigation intensified. Every inch of the prison was searched for hidden passages or security breaches. Background checks were run on all staff members going back 5 years. Polygraph tests were administered to anyone who had contact with the pregnant inmates. Still, nothing. The investigators found themselves chasing shadows, pursuing leads that went nowhere. But the pregnancies didn't stop. 3 weeks later, Jennifer Walsh, serving time for assault, tested positive. Then came Lisa Rodriguez, in for fraud. Within 6 weeks, 4 inmates had become pregnant, under impossible circumstances. The prison was in chaos. Guards whispered among themselves during shift changes. Inmates huddled in groups, speculating about what was really happening behind the walls of Riverside. Dr. Michael Harrison, the prison's consulting physician, was brought in to examine the situation from a medical perspective. He had worked with correctional facilities for 15 years and had never encountered anything like this. The pregnancies were all legitimate, all progressing normally, but the circumstances defied all logic and explanation. During his interviews with the pregnant inmates, Dr. Harrison noticed something disturbing. Each woman displayed signs of severe psychological distress. They were anxious, withdrawn, and exhibited symptoms consistent with trauma. When he asked about their pregnancies, they would become visibly agitated and refuse to answer. Whatever had happened to these women, it had left them deeply scarred. The prison's routine began to break down as paranoia spread. Inmates demanded answers that no one could provide. Some refused to leave their cells, convinced that whatever was causing the pregnancies might happen to them next. Others formed protective groups, watching each other constantly. The atmosphere became so tense that fights broke out regularly, forcing guards to impose lockdown procedures multiple times per week. Meanwhile, the investigation continued to hit dead ends. Security expert David Chen was brought in from the state capitol to conduct an independent review of Riverside's systems. Chen had investigated dozens of prison security breaches throughout his career, but this case baffled him completely. Every camera was functioning properly. Every security protocol was being followed. Every staff member had been cleared through extensive background checks. The timing of the pregnancies also puzzled investigators. The women had become pregnant over a span of several weeks, suggesting that whatever was causing the pregnancies was ongoing, not a single incident. This meant that somewhere in the prison, there was an active security breach that no one could identify or locate. Chen decided to take a different approach. Instead of looking for obvious breaches, he began mapping the daily routines of each pregnant inmate. Where did they go? Who did they interact with? What did they have in common? The answer, when it finally emerged, would shock everyone involved in the investigation. All 4 women worked in the prison laundry facility. The laundry was located in the basement level of Riverside, a sprawling area filled with industrial washing machines and dryers. It was considered one of the safer work assignments in the prison because it was isolated from the main population and heavily monitored by security cameras, or so everyone thought. When Chen and his team conducted a thorough examination of the laundry facility, they made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden behind one of the massive dryer units, obscured by years of lint and dust, was a small gap in the concrete wall. The gap was barely visible and could easily be mistaken for normal wear and tear in the aging building. But when Chen investigated further, he realized this wasn't just a crack in the wall. Someone had deliberately created an opening, carefully concealing it to avoid detection. The gap led to a maintenance tunnel that ran beneath the prison, a tunnel that connected to the men's facility located half a mile away. The revelation sent shockwaves through the entire correction system. For months, possibly years, there had been a secret passage connecting the women's maximum security prison to the men's facility. The tunnel was narrow and cramped, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, but it provided a hidden route that completely bypassed all security measures. Chen's team traced the tunnel from the women's laundry facility all the way to its exit point in the men's prison maintenance area. The construction was sophisticated, clearly the work of someone with engineering knowledge and access to proper tools. This wasn't a hastily dug escape route, but a carefully planned and executed breach that had taken considerable time and effort to complete. But who had built it? And how had it remained undetected for so long? The investigation was about to take an even more shocking turn as investigators realized the true scope of what had been happening beneath Riverside Maximum Security Correctional Facility. The discovery of the tunnel explained how the pregnancies had occurred, but it raised even more disturbing questions. Who knew about the passage? How many people were involved? And most importantly, how many inmates had used this secret route without anyone knowing? The investigation team knew they had uncovered something massive, but the real shock was yet to come. As they began mapping the tunnel system more thoroughly, they discovered it wasn't just a simple passage between 2 facilities. The tunnel network was far more extensive than anyone had imagined, with multiple branches and hidden chambers that had been carved out over what appeared to be several years. Detective Amanda Foster, brought in from the State Bureau of Investigation, couldn't believe what she was seeing. In her 20-year career investigating organized crime and prison corruption, she had never encountered anything this elaborate. The tunnel system showed signs of regular maintenance, proper ventilation, and even makeshift lighting powered by tapped electrical lines. This wasn't the work of desperate inmates trying to escape. This was something far more calculated and disturbing. The first breakthrough came when Foster's team discovered personal belongings hidden in one of the tunnel chambers. Clothing, letters, and other items that clearly didn't belong to any of the pregnant inmates. These belongings told a different story, one that made everyone involved realize they were dealing with something much darker than anyone had suspected. As the investigation deepened, Foster began interviewing the pregnant inmates again, but this time with a different approach. Instead of asking how they became pregnant, she focused on their emotional state and their daily routines. What she discovered made her stomach turn. These women weren't willing participants in whatever had been happening in those tunnels. They were victims. Rebecca Thompson finally broke her silence during her third interview with Foster. Sitting in a secure interrogation room, Rebecca's hands shook as she began to speak for the first time in months. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she revealed the horrifying truth about what had been happening beneath Riverside. The tunnel system, Rebecca explained, had been discovered by a group of male inmates from the connected facility over 2 years ago, but instead of using it to escape, they had turned it into something far more sinister. They had been using the passage to access the women's facility during specific times when they knew the laundry area would be minimally supervised. The male inmates had developed an elaborate system of lookouts and signals that allowed them to move through the tunnels undetected. They knew the guard rotation schedules, the camera blind spots, and exactly when the laundry facility would be empty except for the women assigned to work there. What happened next was a systematic pattern of assault that had been going on for months. Rebecca's testimony revealed that the male inmates had been targeting specific women who worked in the laundry facility. They would emerge from the tunnel during shift changes or maintenance periods when security was at its lowest. The women were threatened, intimidated, and told that if they ever reported what happened, they would face retaliation not just from the male inmates, but from corrupt staff members who were allegedly involved in covering up the tunnel's existence. Foster realized she wasn't just investigating unexplained pregnancies anymore. She was uncovering a massive conspiracy involving multiple inmates and potentially corrupt prison staff. The scope of the cover-up suggested that someone in authority had knowledge of the tunnel system and had either chosen to ignore it or actively participated in hiding its existence. Maria Santos confirmed Rebecca's account when she finally agreed to speak. Through tears, she described months of living in terror, knowing that at any moment during her work shifts, she could become a victim again. She had tried to request a transfer to a different work assignment, but her requests had been mysteriously denied or lost in paperwork. Now she understood why. Someone wanted these women to remain accessible. The investigation team began reviewing personnel records with new eyes. They looked for patterns in work assignments, shift schedules, and who had access to keys for the laundry facility. What they found was shocking. Several male guards from both facilities had been requesting overtime shifts that coincided with the times when the tunnel activity was most likely occurring. Guard supervisor Thomas Mitchell had been working unusual hours for over a year, often volunteering for shifts that others avoided. When investigators examined his financial records, they discovered unexplained cash deposits that suggested he was being paid for something beyond his normal duties. Mitchell became the first staff member to be arrested in connection with the tunnel conspiracy. Under questioning, Mitchell revealed that the tunnel system was far more organized than anyone had imagined. The male inmates involved had created a detailed operation with specific roles and responsibilities. Some served as lookouts, others maintained the tunnel, and a select few actually used the passage to access the women's facility. The operation had its own hierarchy, rules, and even a system for recruiting new participants. But Mitchell's most shocking revelation was yet to come. The tunnel hadn't been built by inmates at all. It was part of an old maintenance system that had been abandoned during prison renovations years earlier. The inmates had simply discovered it and modified it for their purposes. This meant that architectural plans somewhere in the prison's records would have shown the tunnel's existence, raising questions about how many people in authority positions knew about the passage and chose to remain silent. Jennifer Walsh and Lisa Rodriguez provided additional testimony that painted an even more disturbing picture. They described a culture of fear that had developed among the women who worked in the laundry facility. Everyone knew something was wrong, but they were too terrified to speak up. The male inmates had made it clear that reporting the incidents would result in severe consequences, not just for the victims, but for their families on the outside as well. The investigation revealed that the tunnel conspiracy involved at least 12 male inmates and 3 prison staff members. The operation had been generating money through various illegal activities, with the assaults being just one component of a larger criminal enterprise operating within the prison system. Drugs, contraband, and information were all being trafficked through the tunnel network. Dr. Harrison's medical examinations of all the women who had worked in the laundry facility over the past 2 years revealed that the 4 known pregnancies were likely just the tip of the iceberg. Several other women showed signs of trauma and stress that suggested they too had been victimized, but had been too afraid to come forward or seek medical attention. The psychological impact on the victims was severe and long-lasting. Many of the women developed symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. Some requested protective custody, while others asked to be transferred to different facilities entirely. The prison's mental health resources were completely overwhelmed by the number of women who suddenly needed counseling and support services. As news of the investigation began to leak to the media, public outrage grew. How had such an elaborate criminal conspiracy operated undetected in a maximum security facility? What oversight failures had allowed this to continue for so long? Families of inmates demanded answers, and civil rights organizations called for a complete overhaul of the prison system. The State Corrections Department launched its own internal investigation, separate from the criminal probe. They brought in outside consultants to review security protocols at every facility in the state system. What they found was a pattern of negligence, inadequate supervision, and institutional failures that had created conditions allowing such conspiracies to flourish. Warden Collins found herself at the center of a media firestorm. Despite her 20 years of service, she became the face of institutional failure. Critics argued that such an elaborate operation couldn't have existed without her knowledge, or at least her negligence in overseeing security protocols. Collins maintained her innocence, but acknowledged that systematic failures under her leadership had allowed the conspiracy to operate. The tunnel was immediately sealed, but investigators knew that was just the beginning. They had to ensure that similar passages didn't exist at other facilities, and that the security vulnerabilities that had allowed this conspiracy to flourish were addressed throughout the entire correction system. The male inmates involved in the conspiracy began turning on each other as the investigation intensified. Some provided information about the operation's structure in exchange for reduced sentences, while others maintained their silence. The complex web of relationships and criminal activities that had developed around the tunnel system would take months to fully unravel. But the investigation was far from over. As more victims came forward and additional evidence was uncovered, it became clear that the conspiracy at Riverside was part of an even larger pattern of corruption and abuse that extended beyond a single facility. The shocking revelations that were yet to come would rock the entire corrections system to its core. Detective Foster knew she was dealing with something unprecedented. But what happened next would shatter everything she thought she understood about institutional corruption. As the investigation expanded beyond Riverside, a pattern began emerging that no one had anticipated. Similar reports were surfacing from facilities across 3 different states. The breakthrough came when Foster received a call from Detective Raymond Cruz in Nevada. Cruz had been investigating suspicious pregnancies at Desert Valley Correctional Facility for Women, located over 800 miles from Riverside. The similarities were too striking to ignore. 4 unexplained pregnancies, all involving women who worked in isolated areas of the prison, all victims too terrified to speak about their experiences. Foster and Cruz began comparing notes, and what they discovered sent chills down their spines. The timing of the pregnancies at both facilities followed an almost identical pattern. The victims showed the same psychological trauma. Even more disturbing, Several of the male inmates who had been transferred between facilities over the past 2 years were connected to both locations. Marcus Williams had been transferred from Riverside's male facility to Desert Valley's men's unit 6 months before the first pregnancy was reported in Nevada. James Parker had made the same transfer route, but in reverse, arriving at Riverside just weeks before Rebecca Thompson's pregnancy was discovered. The connection was undeniable, but the implications were staggering. These weren't isolated incidents or opportunistic crimes. This was an organized network operating across state lines, involving multiple correctional facilities and suggesting a level of coordination that reached far beyond individual prisons. Foster realized she wasn't just investigating a local conspiracy anymore. She was uncovering what appeared to be a multi-state criminal organization operating within the prison system itself. The investigation team expanded to include federal authorities. Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit joined the task force, bringing resources and expertise in investigating large-scale institutional fraud. Chen had spent years pursuing corruption cases, but even she was shocked by the scope of what they were uncovering. Chen's first move was to request transfer records for all inmates and staff who had moved between facilities over the past 3 years. The data revealed a disturbing pattern. Certain inmates were being transferred in coordinated movements that seemed to serve no legitimate correctional purpose. These transfers were happening more frequently than normal protocols would suggest, and they always involved facilities where unexplained incidents had later been reported. The financial investigation revealed another layer of the conspiracy. Money was flowing between accounts connected to prison staff members across multiple states. Bank records showed regular deposits that couldn't be explained by legitimate employment income. Phone records revealed frequent communication between staff members at different facilities, communication that had no official purpose or documentation. Agent Chen discovered that the conspiracy had its own internal communication system. Coded messages were being passed through official prison correspondence, disguised as routine administrative communications. The codes were sophisticated, suggesting that someone with intelligence or military background was coordinating the operation. This wasn't amateur criminal activity. This was professional, organized, and systematic. The investigation took another shocking turn when Chen's team discovered that some of the male inmates involved weren't typical criminals. Several had backgrounds in construction, engineering, and telecommunications. Their skills had been deliberately utilized to create and maintain the infrastructure that allowed the conspiracy to operate. The tunnel at Riverside wasn't just a discovered passage. It was part of a deliberately modified system that connected multiple areas of the prison complex. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, a forensic psychologist brought in to evaluate the victims, made a disturbing observation. The trauma patterns she was seeing weren't consistent with random criminal acts. The psychological damage suggested systematic, repeated victimization, designed to ensure silence and compliance. The perpetrators weren't just committing crimes. They were implementing a deliberate strategy to control their victims and prevent reporting. Reynolds interviewed dozens of women across multiple facilities, and the stories that emerged painted a picture of institutional terrorism. Women were being targeted not just for assault, but for a comprehensive system of intimidation and control. They were told their families would be harmed if they spoke out. They were shown evidence that prison staff were involved, making them believe that reporting would be useless or dangerous. The conspiracy had created its own internal justice system. Women who showed any signs of considering reporting were subjected to additional intimidation. Their mail was intercepted, their phone calls monitored by conspirators, and their daily routines manipulated to increase their vulnerability. The operation had essentially created a prison within the prison, where victims were trapped not just by physical walls, but by fear and systematic psychological manipulation. Agent Chen realized that dismantling this network would require more than just arresting the obvious participants. The conspiracy had created institutional changes that would need to be completely overhauled. Policies, procedures, and personnel systems had all been compromised. The corruption was so deep that it had become embedded in the normal operations of multiple facilities. The investigation expanded to include facilities in Texas, Arizona, and California. In each location, investigators found evidence of similar patterns: unexplained pregnancies, traumatized victims, modified infrastructure, and corrupted staff members. The conspiracy wasn't limited to a few facilities. It was a network that had been operating across the southwestern United States for at least 3 years. Thomas Mitchell's cooperation proved invaluable as the investigation widened. Under federal protection, he provided details about how the network operated, who the key players were, and how they had managed to avoid detection for so long. His testimony revealed that the conspiracy had infiltrated hiring processes, ensuring that sympathetic staff members were placed in key positions across multiple facilities. The network had its own recruitment system for both staff and inmates. New participants were carefully vetted and gradually introduced to the operation. They started with minor violations of protocol, then gradually became involved in more serious criminal activity. By the time they were fully integrated, they were too compromised to withdraw or report the conspiracy. Mitchell explained how the network had developed countermeasures for almost every security protocol. They knew which cameras had blind spots, which guards could be trusted or corrupted, and which administrative procedures could be manipulated. The conspiracy had essentially created its own intelligence operation within the prison system. The financial scope of the operation was staggering. Agent Chen's forensic accountants discovered that the network was generating hundreds of thousands of dollars through various illegal activities. The assaults were just one component of a larger criminal enterprise that included drug trafficking, contraband smuggling, and extortion. The money was being laundered through legitimate businesses and investment accounts, creating a sophisticated financial infrastructure. Dr. Reynolds continued interviewing victims, and each conversation revealed new layers of the conspiracy's psychological manipulation. Women were told that their pregnancies were their fault, that they had somehow invited the attacks. They were convinced that reporting would result in their children being taken away or their sentences being extended. The gaslighting was systematic and professional. The investigation revealed that the network had been studying successful criminal organizations and incorporating their methods. They had analyzed how organized crime families maintained silence, how terrorist cells operated without detection, and how corporate conspiracies avoided prosecution. This wasn't street-level criminal activity. This was organized crime operating within the correction system. Agent Chen's team discovered that the conspiracy had backup plans for almost every scenario. If one facility was compromised, they could quickly shift operations to another location. If key personnel were arrested, they had predetermined succession plans. The network had been designed to survive disruption and continue operating even if partially exposed. The media coverage intensified as more details emerged. Civil rights organizations demanded congressional hearings. Families of victims filed federal lawsuits. The scandal was becoming a national story that threatened to expose systemic failures throughout the entire correction system. The pressure on investigators to deliver results was enormous, but the complexity of the conspiracy made quick resolution impossible. Warden Collins found herself testifying before a congressional subcommittee, trying to explain how such an extensive criminal network had operated under her supervision. Her testimony revealed institutional problems that went far beyond individual facilities. The correction system itself had structural vulnerabilities that had been exploited by sophisticated criminal organizations. The investigation uncovered evidence that the conspiracy had been planning to expand operations to federal facilities. They had identified targets, begun recruiting potential participants, and started mapping the infrastructure of federal prisons. The network's ambitions were far greater than anyone had initially realized. Agent Chen knew that prosecuting this case would require unprecedented coordination between multiple jurisdictions, federal agencies, and state authorities. The conspiracy had created legal complexities that would challenge the justice system's ability to hold all participants accountable. But she was determined to ensure that every victim received justice and that the network was completely dismantled. As the investigation continued, more victims found the courage to come forward. Each new testimony added pieces to the puzzle, revealing the true scope of what had been happening within America's prison system. The conspiracy at Riverside had been just the beginning. What investigators were uncovering would change how the entire correction system operated. But the most shocking revelations were still to come. The network's true purpose was about to be revealed, and when it was, it would shake the foundations of institutional trust throughout the country. The pregnant inmates had been victims of something far more organized and sinister than anyone could have imagined. The breakthrough that changed everything came from an unexpected source. Dr. Emily Rodriguez, a forensic data analyst brought in from the Department of Justice, was reviewing digital evidence when she noticed something that had been overlooked by everyone else. Hidden in the metadata of prison security systems across multiple facilities, she found digital fingerprints that revealed the conspiracy's true scope and purpose. The network wasn't just operating to commit crimes within the prison system. They were using correctional facilities as testing grounds for a much larger operation that extended far beyond prison walls. The pregnancies, the assaults, the psychological manipulation, all of it was part of a systematic study in human control and institutional corruption that had implications reaching into the highest levels of government and corporate power. Rodriguez discovered encrypted files buried deep within prison computer systems. These files contained detailed records of everything the network had been doing, but they weren't just criminal records. They were research data. The conspiracy had been conducting unauthorized human experimentation, using prison populations as test subjects for psychological manipulation techniques, institutional control methods, and systematic intimidation strategies. The victims weren't just random targets. They had been specifically selected based on psychological profiles, family backgrounds, and predicted responses to trauma. The network had been studying how different types of people reacted to various forms of abuse, documenting which methods were most effective at ensuring silence and compliance. The pregnancies were just one measurable outcome in a much larger experiment. Agent Chen felt sick as she reviewed Rodriguez's findings. The conspiracy had been treating human beings like laboratory animals, subjecting them to calculated abuse while meticulously recording their responses. The data was being compiled into reports that read like academic research papers, complete with statistical analysis and recommendations for future implementation. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. The research wasn't being conducted for academic purposes or even criminal profit. It was being compiled for clients outside the prison system. Corporate entities, government agencies, and private organizations had been purchasing this data to use in their own operations. The network had been selling information about human psychological manipulation to anyone willing to pay for it. Detective Foster uncovered purchase orders and payment records that revealed the true customers for this research. Private security companies were buying data about intimidation techniques. Corporations were purchasing information about employee control methods. Even government agencies were acquiring research on population management and psychological manipulation. The conspiracy had created a marketplace for human suffering. The financial records showed payments from dozens of organizations across multiple industries. Defense contractors wanted information about prisoner interrogation techniques. Private prison companies were buying data about inmate control methods. Marketing firms were purchasing research about psychological manipulation for advertising purposes. The network had turned human trauma into a commodity. Dr. Reynolds reviewed the psychological profiles that had been compiled on hundreds of victims. The level of detail was horrifying. The network had documented everything from childhood trauma to family relationships, creating comprehensive maps of each person's psychological vulnerabilities. They knew exactly which buttons to push to break someone's will and ensure their silence. The research files revealed that the network had been experimenting with different combinations of physical, psychological, and social pressures. They tested how isolation affected compliance. They studied the impact of threats against family members. They documented the effectiveness of various forms of gaslighting and psychological manipulation. Every aspect of human vulnerability had been catalogued and weaponized. Agent Chen realized they weren't just investigating a criminal conspiracy anymore. They had uncovered a systematic violation of human rights that had been operating under the cover of legitimate correctional operations. The network had essentially turned multiple prison facilities into secret research laboratories, where human beings were subjected to unauthorized experimentation without consent or knowledge. The investigation revealed that several high-ranking officials in various government agencies had been aware of the research, but had allowed it to continue. The data being produced was considered valuable for national security purposes, law enforcement training, and corporate security applications. The suffering of the victims had been deemed acceptable collateral damage for the greater good of institutional control research. Marcus Williams, one of the key inmates in the network, finally agreed to cooperate when faced with federal charges that could result in life imprisonment. His testimony revealed the internal structure of the research operation and how inmates had been recruited to participate as both subjects and researchers. Many didn't understand the true purpose of what they were doing, believing they were simply involved in criminal enterprises. Williams explained that the network had developed sophisticated methods for recruiting participants at every level. Inmates were offered reduced sentences, better living conditions, and protection in exchange for cooperation. Staff members were provided with financial incentives, career advancement opportunities, and job security. Everyone was given just enough information to perform their role without understanding the complete picture. The psychological manipulation extended to the participants themselves. The network had convinced many of them that they were serving a patriotic purpose, helping to develop techniques that would protect national security or improve law enforcement capabilities. They were told that their work would ultimately make society safer, even if individual victims had to suffer in the short term. Dr. Rodriguez's analysis of the digital evidence revealed communication between the network and external clients that showed how the research was being applied in real-world situations. Techniques developed through prison experimentation were being implemented in corporate environments, military operations, and law enforcement activities across the country. Private military contractors had incorporated intimidation methods developed through the prison research into their overseas operations. Corporate security firms were using psychological manipulation techniques to control employee behavior and suppress whistleblowing. Law enforcement agencies were implementing interrogation methods that had been tested on prison populations. The scope of the conspiracy extended far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. The network had created a pipeline from prison-based human experimentation to real-world application of psychological control techniques. They had weaponized human suffering and turned it into a profitable enterprise that served powerful interests throughout society. Agent Chen's investigation team expanded to include specialists in human trafficking, international organized crime, and corporate corruption. The conspiracy had elements of all these areas, creating jurisdictional challenges that required unprecedented cooperation between agencies. The case was becoming one of the largest human rights investigations in American history. The media coverage intensified as details of the research operation began to emerge. Civil rights organizations called for congressional investigations. International human rights groups demanded United Nations intervention. The scandal was threatening to expose systematic human rights violations that had been operating with government knowledge and corporate funding. Warden Collins faced additional charges as evidence emerged that she had knowingly allowed her facility to be used for unauthorized human experimentation. Her defense claimed that she had been told the research was legally authorized and served legitimate law enforcement training purposes. But prosecutors argued that the systematic nature of the abuse should have raised obvious red flags. The investigation revealed that the network had been planning to expand their operations internationally. They had identified potential partners in private prison companies operating in other countries where human rights protections were weaker. The conspiracy had global ambitions that extended far beyond American corrections facilities. Dr. Reynolds continued working with victims as more women found the courage to come forward. Each new testimony revealed additional layers of the systematic abuse and experimentation that had been conducted. The psychological damage was severe and would require years of specialized treatment to address. Many victims would never fully recover from their experiences. The financial investigation uncovered a complex web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and legitimate businesses that had been used to launder money and hide the true sources of funding for the research operation. The network had created a sophisticated financial infrastructure that made tracing the money extremely difficult. Agent Chen discovered that several academic institutions had unknowingly published research based on data collected through the prison experimentation. The network had been sanitizing their findings and presenting them as legitimate social science research. Universities and research journals had been unwittingly participating in the dissemination of knowledge gained through human rights violations. The conspiracy had also infiltrated professional conferences and training programs where their techniques were being taught to law enforcement officers, corporate security personnel, and government agents. The methods developed through prison-based human experimentation were being legitimized through official training channels and professional development programs. Thomas Mitchell's continued cooperation revealed that the network had been developing new techniques for psychological manipulation that were being tested on incoming inmates. They had created intake procedures designed to identify the most vulnerable individuals who could be easily controlled and exploited. The entire correctional process had been weaponized for research purposes. The investigation uncovered evidence that the network had been collaborating with foreign intelligence services and international criminal organizations. Techniques developed in American prisons were being shared with overseas partners in exchange for funding and operational support. The conspiracy had become a component of international organized crime. Detective Foster discovered that several judges and prosecutors had been influenced by network participants to ensure that specific types of individuals were sentenced to facilities where they could be used as research subjects. The corruption had infected the entire criminal justice system, from arrest through incarceration and beyond. The network had also been studying the long-term effects of their psychological manipulation techniques by tracking victims after their release from prison. They had created systems for monitoring former inmates to document how institutional trauma affected their post-release behavior, employment prospects, and social relationships. Agent Chen realized that prosecuting this case would require fundamental changes to how human rights violations were investigated and punished in the United States. The conspiracy had exposed systematic weaknesses in oversight and accountability that extended throughout multiple institutions and levels of government. The investigation revealed that the network had been developing techniques specifically designed to be undetectable by standard oversight mechanisms. They had studied how inspections were conducted, how complaints were processed, and how evidence was typically gathered. Every aspect of accountability had been analyzed and circumvented. Dr. Rodriguez's analysis showed that the digital infrastructure supporting the conspiracy was far more sophisticated than initially understood. The network had developed encrypted communication systems, secure data storage methods, and advanced surveillance capabilities that rivaled those of government intelligence agencies. The research files revealed that the network had been studying not just individual psychological manipulation, but also group dynamics and institutional control methods. They had experimented with different ways of managing prison populations, testing which approaches were most effective at preventing organized resistance or rebellion. The conspiracy had created detailed profiles of every staff member at participating facilities, identifying which individuals could be corrupted, intimidated, or manipulated into cooperation. They had developed systematic approaches for neutralizing potential whistleblowers and ensuring institutional silence. Agent Chen's team discovered that the network had been planning to franchise their operations, selling their methods and infrastructure to other criminal organizations interested in conducting similar research. They had developed training materials, operational manuals, and technical specifications that could be implemented at new locations. The investigation revealed that several victims had been deliberately kept pregnant multiple times as part of long-term studies on the psychological effects of reproductive trauma. The network had been documenting how repeated victimization affected behavior, mental health, and social functioning over extended periods. The scope of the human experimentation was staggering. Hundreds of women across multiple states had been subjected to systematic abuse designed to test various hypotheses about human psychological manipulation. The research had been conducted with the same methodical approach used in legitimate scientific studies, but without any ethical oversight or participant consent. As the investigation continued to expand, Agent Chen knew they were uncovering something that would fundamentally change how society understood institutional corruption and human rights violations. The conspiracy at Riverside had been just the visible tip of a massive iceberg that threatened the foundations of justice and human dignity throughout the American correctional system. The most shocking revelations were still to come, as investigators began to understand the true purpose behind the systematic experimentation and how the results were being used to influence policies and practices far beyond prison walls. The true scale of what Agent Chen's team had uncovered became clear when they discovered the network's crown jewel, a detailed manual titled Institutional Control Through Systematic Trauma Application. This document, found encrypted on servers hidden across 3 states, outlined methodologies that would make seasoned investigators question everything they thought they knew about human rights in America. Dr. Rodriguez's forensic analysis revealed that the manual contained step-by-step instructions for breaking human will through calculated psychological pressure. The techniques weren't random acts of cruelty. They were scientifically designed protocols that had been refined through years of testing on unwilling subjects. Each method had been calibrated for maximum psychological impact while leaving minimal physical evidence. The manual divided victims into categories based on their backgrounds, personalities, and vulnerabilities. Category A subjects were described as high-resistance individuals requiring intensive intervention. Category B subjects were moderate compliance targets suitable for standard protocols. Category C subjects were labeled immediate compliance candidates optimal for rapid processing. The clinical language made Agent Chen's blood run cold. Detective Foster discovered that the network had been recruiting participants through a sophisticated vetting system that extended far beyond prison walls. They had infiltrated job placement agencies that supplied prison staff, ensuring that sympathetic individuals were placed in key positions. They had also established connections with sentencing organizations, influencing which inmates ended up at specific facilities. The recruitment process for new staff members involved gradual compromise and escalating involvement. New employees would first be asked to overlook minor policy violations. Then they would be encouraged to bend rules for seemingly harmless reasons. By the time they realized the true nature of what they were supporting, they were too deeply implicated to withdraw safely. Marcus Williams provided testimony that revealed the network's internal hierarchy and command structure. At the top were what he called the architects, individuals who designed the experiments and analyzed the results. Below them were coordinators, who managed day-to-day operations across multiple facilities. At the bottom were implementers, who carried out specific tasks without understanding the broader purpose. Williams explained that most participants never saw the complete picture. Each person knew only their specific role and a limited amount of information about connected activities. This compartmentalization made the conspiracy extremely difficult to detect and nearly impossible to dismantle through traditional investigation methods. The financial investigation revealed that the network had been generating revenue through multiple streams. Beyond selling research data to external clients, they had been trafficking contraband, manipulating inmate accounts, and extorting money from victims' families. The total revenue was estimated in the millions of dollars annually. Agent Chen discovered that several prominent research institutions had unknowingly legitimized the network's findings by incorporating their data into published studies. Academic papers on prison psychology, institutional behavior, and trauma response had been based partially on research conducted through systematic human rights violations. The corruption of legitimate scholarship added another layer of institutional betrayal. Dr. Reynolds interviewed additional victims who revealed that the experimentation had extended beyond physical assault and psychological manipulation. The network had been testing various drugs and chemical compounds on unwilling subjects, documenting their effects on behavior, memory, and emotional response. Some women reported periods of confusion, memory loss, and altered mental states that they couldn't explain. The medical records that Dr. Reynolds reviewed showed patterns of unexplained health issues among women who had worked in targeted areas of various facilities. Symptoms included chronic fatigue, memory problems, reproductive issues, and psychological disturbances that were consistent with exposure to unknown substances. The network had been conducting unauthorized medical experimentation alongside their psychological research. Thomas Mitchell's continued cooperation revealed that the network had developed detailed profiles of every aspect of prison operations. They knew which security cameras had blind spots, which communication systems could be monitored, and which staff members could be trusted or manipulated. They had essentially created a shadow administration that operated parallel to official prison management. The investigation uncovered evidence that the network had been influencing policy decisions at state and federal levels. Through strategic placement of sympathetic individuals in government positions, they had been able to shape regulations, funding decisions, and oversight procedures to benefit their operations. The corruption extended into the highest levels of corrections administration. Agent Chen's team discovered that the network had been preparing for eventual exposure by developing contingency plans and escape routes. They had identified potential scapegoats, prepared false documentation, and established offshore financial accounts. The sophistication of their planning suggested they had always expected to be discovered eventually. The digital evidence revealed that the network had been conducting surveillance on investigators, journalists, and civil rights activists who might pose threats to their operations. They had developed detailed intelligence files on potential enemies and had been prepared to neutralize threats through intimidation, discreditation, or worse. Dr. Rodriguez found evidence that the network had been experimenting with new technologies for psychological manipulation, including subliminal audio systems, electromagnetic field generators, and advanced surveillance equipment. They had been testing whether technology could enhance their ability to control and manipulate human behavior without detection. The investigation revealed that several high-profile cases of inmate deaths and suicides at participating facilities had actually been murders designed to eliminate potential witnesses or uncooperative subjects. The network had been willing to kill to protect their operations, making every person involved in the investigation a potential target. Detective Foster uncovered evidence that the network had been planning to expand their operations into juvenile facilities, homeless shelters, and mental health institutions. They had identified vulnerable populations throughout society that could serve as subjects for their research. The conspiracy's ambitions extended far beyond the prison system. Agent Chen discovered that foreign governments had been purchasing research data from the network for use in their own population control programs. Techniques developed through American prison experimentation were being implemented by authoritarian regimes around the world to suppress dissent and control their citizens. The investigation revealed that the network had been studying the effectiveness of different trauma combinations on long-term behavioral modification. They had been deliberately exposing victims to multiple forms of abuse simultaneously to document which combinations produced the most lasting psychological damage and compliance. Dr. Reynolds found evidence that the network had been tracking victims after their release from prison to study the long-term effects of their experimentation. They had maintained surveillance networks that monitored former inmates for years, documenting how institutional trauma affected their ability to reintegrate into society. The financial records showed that the network had been investing their profits in legitimate businesses and political campaigns, using their wealth to gain influence and protection. They had been building a power structure that extended far beyond criminal enterprise into legitimate political and economic institutions. Thomas Mitchell revealed that the network had been recruiting victims' family members as informants and agents, using threats and financial incentives to build surveillance networks that extended into communities throughout the country. The conspiracy had tentacles reaching into every aspect of society. Agent Chen's team discovered that the network had been collaborating with human trafficking organizations to identify and acquire specific types of victims for their research. They had been placing orders for individuals with particular psychological profiles, treating human beings like laboratory equipment to be purchased and utilized. The investigation revealed that several prominent politicians and business leaders had been clients of the network, purchasing research data for use in their own operations. The conspiracy had been serving the interests of powerful individuals who wanted to understand and manipulate human behavior for their own purposes. Dr. Rodriguez found evidence that the network had been developing artificial intelligence systems trained on data collected through their human experimentation. They had been creating computer programs capable of predicting and manipulating human behavior based on patterns identified through systematic abuse of prison populations. The scope of the conspiracy was so vast that Agent Chen realized traditional prosecution methods would be inadequate. The network had corrupted so many institutions and involved so many individuals that dismantling it would require unprecedented coordination between multiple agencies and jurisdictions. Detective Foster discovered that the network had been preparing to go international, establishing partnerships with criminal organizations and corrupt governments in countries with weaker human rights protections. They had been planning to export their methods and expand their research operations globally. The investigation revealed that victims who had attempted to report their experiences had been systematically discredited, intimidated, or eliminated. The network had developed sophisticated methods for neutralizing threats and maintaining operational security that had allowed them to continue their activities for years without detection. As Agent Chen reviewed the complete scope of what they had uncovered, she realized that the pregnant inmates at Riverside had been victims of something far more extensive and sinister than anyone could have imagined. The conspiracy represented a systematic violation of human rights that had been operating with institutional support and government knowledge for years. The network had turned human suffering into a profitable enterprise that served powerful interests throughout society. They had weaponized the prison system to conduct unauthorized research that was being used to manipulate and control people far beyond correctional facilities. The investigation was approaching a critical phase where decisions would need to be made about how to proceed with prosecutions, victim compensation, and systematic reforms. The scope of the conspiracy was so vast that it threatened to overwhelm the justice system's capacity to respond adequately. But Agent Chen was determined to ensure that every victim received justice and that the network was completely dismantled. The women who had suffered at Riverside and dozens of other facilities deserved nothing less than complete accountability for the systematic violations they had endured. The most challenging phase of the investigation was about to begin as prosecutors prepared cases against hundreds of defendants while victims continued coming forward with new testimony about the scope of abuse they had experienced. The conspiracy had tentacles reaching into every level of society, and untangling them would require unprecedented effort and resources. The truth about what had been happening in America's prisons was finally emerging, but the complete story was still being revealed as investigators continued uncovering new evidence and victims found the courage to break their silence. The conspiracy at Riverside had been just the beginning of a much larger and more disturbing pattern of systematic human rights violations. The final phase of Agent Chen's investigation would prove to be the most dangerous as the network realized their entire operation was being exposed. What happened next would test the limits of the justice system and reveal just how far powerful interests would go to protect their investments in human suffering. Dr. Martinez, a psychiatrist brought in to evaluate the psychological damage inflicted on victims, made a discovery that changed everything about how they understood the conspiracy's ultimate purpose. While reviewing medical files from participating facilities, she noticed patterns in medication distribution that had nothing to do with legitimate medical treatment. The network had been systematically drugging inmates with experimental compounds designed to enhance suggestibility and suppress memory formation. These weren't recreational drugs or traditional contraband. They were sophisticated pharmaceutical preparations that had been developed specifically for behavior modification research. The victims hadn't just been physically and psychologically abused, they had been chemically altered without their knowledge or consent. Martinez found evidence that different compounds had been tested on different groups of women to measure their effectiveness. Some drugs increased anxiety and fear responses, making victims more compliant and less likely to resist. Others suppressed memory formation, ensuring that victims couldn't provide clear testimony about their experiences. The most disturbing compounds were designed to increase fertility while suppressing the immune system's ability to reject foreign genetic material. The pregnancies weren't accidental consequences of assault. They were deliberately engineered outcomes designed to study reproductive trauma and its psychological effects. The network had been using pregnancy as a weapon of psychological warfare, documenting how forced reproduction affected behavior, mental health, and social functioning over time. Agent Chen felt physically ill as she reviewed Martinez's findings. The conspiracy had weaponized every aspect of human biology and psychology, turning natural processes into instruments of torture and control. The level of scientific sophistication involved suggested collaboration with pharmaceutical companies and medical research institutions. Detective Foster's investigation into the supply chain for these experimental compounds revealed connections to several major pharmaceutical companies, corporations that had been conducting unauthorized human testing through the network. Corporate executives had been purchasing access to prison populations for drug trials that would never have been approved through legitimate medical research channels. The financial records showed payments from pharmaceutical companies to network coordinators for research services and population access fees. These corporations had been using the conspiracy as a testing ground for drugs intended for military, law enforcement, and intelligence applications. The victims had been guinea pigs for chemical weapons development, disguised as medical research. Thomas Mitchell provided testimony about how the drugging protocols were implemented and monitored. Medical staff at participating facilities had been replaced or corrupted to ensure compliance with the experimental regimens. Legitimate healthcare had been completely compromised to serve the network's research objectives. The investigation revealed that several government agencies had been aware of and funding the pharmaceutical experimentation. Defense Department contracts showed payments for research into enhanced interrogation pharmaceuticals and population compliance compounds. The network had been serving national security interests while generating profits from human suffering. Dr. Reynolds discovered that the psychological manipulation techniques being tested were far more advanced than traditional torture methods. The network had been developing integrated approaches that combined chemical, physical, and psychological pressures to achieve complete behavioral control. They had been trying to create perfectly compliant human beings who could be programmed like machines. Agent Chen's team uncovered evidence that the network had been sharing their research with international partners, including foreign intelligence services and multinational corporations. Techniques developed through American prison experimentation were control populations and suppress dissent. The being implemented globally to investigation revealed that several high-ranking military officers had been involved in overseeing the research programs. They had been using their positions to provide cover for the network's activities, while ensuring that useful results were incorporated into official training and operational procedures. Marcus Williams testified about the network's plans for expansion into other institutional settings. They had been preparing to implement their techniques in schools, hospitals, and corporate environments. The conspiracy's ultimate goal was to develop methods for controlling human behavior that could be applied throughout society. The digital evidence showed that the network had been developing artificial intelligence systems capable of predicting individual psychological responses to different forms of manipulation. They had been creating computer programs that could design personalized torture regimens, optimized for each victim's specific vulnerabilities. Detective Foster discovered that the network had been recruiting victims through manipulation of the legal system itself. They had been influencing arrests, prosecutions, and sentencing decisions to ensure that individuals with desired characteristics ended up in their experimental facilities. The entire criminal justice process had been corrupted to serve their research needs. The investigation revealed that foreign governments had been providing funding and resources to support the network's activities in exchange for access to their research results. American prison populations had been serving as test subjects for techniques that were being used to suppress human rights around the world. Agent Chen found evidence that the network had been developing methods for mass psychological manipulation that could be implemented through media, technology, and environmental modifications. They had been studying how to influence entire populations without individual awareness or consent. Dr. Martinez discovered that many victims had been deliberately kept in experimental programs for years through manipulation of their legal cases. Appeals had been sabotaged, parole applications denied, and sentences extended to ensure continued access to research subjects. The corruption extended throughout the entire legal system. The financial investigation revealed that the network had been laundering money through charitable organizations and religious institutions. They had been using legitimate humanitarian organizations as fronts for their criminal activities, while corrupting the missions of groups dedicated to helping vulnerable populations. Thomas Mitchell provided details about the network's internal security measures and their preparations for potential exposure. They had been developing plans to eliminate evidence, silence witnesses, and escape prosecution through corruption of the investigation process itself. The investigation uncovered evidence that several prominent politicians had been receiving campaign contributions from network-connected sources in exchange for protecting their operations and blocking oversight initiatives. The conspiracy had been buying political protection at the highest levels of government. Dr. Reynolds found that the network had been studying intergenerational trauma transmission, documenting how their experimentation affected not just direct victims, but their children and families. They had been deliberately creating cycles of psychological damage that would persist for generations. Agent Chen discovered that the network had been collaborating with academic institutions to legitimize their research through publication in respected journals. University researchers had been unknowingly incorporating data from human rights violations into their studies, lending scientific credibility to torture techniques. The investigation revealed that the network had been developing techniques for erasing memories and implanting false recollections in their victims. They had been experimenting with methods for completely rewriting individual psychological histories to serve their control objectives. Detective Foster uncovered evidence that the network had been planning to implement their techniques in immigration detention facilities, using vulnerable migrant populations as test subjects for new forms of psychological control. The conspiracy's reach extended into every aspect of the institutional system designed to manage vulnerable populations. The scope of corruption was so extensive that Agent Chen realized they were dealing with more than a criminal conspiracy. They had uncovered a systematic assault on human dignity that had infected multiple institutions and levels of government. The network represented a fundamental threat to democratic society and human rights. As the investigation continued expanding, more victims came forward with testimony about experiences they had never understood or been able to explain. The true number of people who had been subjected to the network's experimentation was far higher than anyone had initially estimated. The psychological damage inflicted on victims was so severe that many would require lifelong treatment and support. The network had deliberately created trauma so profound that recovery might be impossible for some survivors. The human cost of their research was incalculable. Agent Chen knew that prosecuting this case would require unprecedented resources and coordination. The network had corrupted so many institutions and involved so many individuals that traditional justice processes would be inadequate. New approaches would be needed to ensure accountability and prevent future occurrences. The investigation was entering its final phase, but the most dangerous period was just beginning. As network participants realized the extent of the exposure, they began implementing their contingency plans to protect themselves and eliminate evidence. The race against time to secure justice for victims was about to intensify. The conspiracy that had started with a few unexplained pregnancies at Riverside had revealed systematic human rights violations that reached into every level of society. The truth was finally emerging, but the battle to hold everyone accountable was just beginning. The web of corruption was about to collapse entirely when Agent Chen received an encrypted message that made her blood run cold. Someone inside the network had discovered the full scope of the investigation and was preparing to activate what they called Protocol 7. The message contained just 3 words that would haunt her for the rest of her career: eliminate all evidence. Within hours, fires broke out simultaneously at 4 different facilities across 3 states. Security cameras malfunctioned at precisely the same moments. Computer servers crashed, taking with them terabytes of digital evidence that had taken months to collect. The network was implementing a scorched earth strategy, willing to destroy everything rather than face complete exposure. Dr. Martinez was reviewing medical files in her hotel room when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her door. The footsteps stopped directly outside her room and remained there for several minutes before moving away. When she checked the hallway, it was empty, but a small device had been placed under her door. The message inside was simple but terrifying: stop digging or join your research subjects. What started as mysterious pregnancies in a maximum security prison revealed a conspiracy so vast and horrifying that it shattered everything we thought we knew about institutional corruption. The network's desperate attempts to destroy evidence only confirmed the depths of their crimes. Today, hundreds of victims are finally receiving justice, and the prison system has undergone complete reform. This case reminds us that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find its way to light.